I personally believe God loved me enough to still call me, and it took maybe a little more pain and suffering, I guess, worldly suffering, you could say. I was in the hospital 9 times. I was about 30 pounds lighter than I am now at my weakest. I needed a blood transfusion at one of the hospitalizations because I'd lost so much blood. And so I think that is true, that he gave me an opportunity to respond, and I didn't, and he still loved me enough to basically put his finger on what was really keeping me from him.
Welcome into the Harvest. This podcast is dedicated to helping you be a disciple and make disciples in modern day life. We cover just practical ways of following Jesus and sharing him with others. And today I'm excited because I've got a local legend, my friend Brian Trainor, who is with us, and he's going to be sharing with us some lessons he's learned about discipleship and disciple making. So Brian, welcome on to the show.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Appreciate it.
Yeah, we've been talking about doing this for a little while, so I'm glad we're making it happen. You stay very busy, and we're going to talk a little bit about your testimony and the story of what God has done to bring you to where you are today and to give you the heart that he's given you. But why don't we just start off? I know you've got some information here, but why don't I just throw it to you? Why don't you tell our audience a little bit more about who you are and what you're up to these days?
Sure, yeah. Thanks, Andrew, and good to be here with everyone today, and hopefully for time. It's awesome that we can record these things and get the information out. So, like I said, my name is Brian. I am 31 years old. I'm here in San Diego. I was born in upstate New York, joined the military after going to West Point for college. At that time, I was a runner, collegiate runner that switched to triathlon, and that was really became my identity, was as an endurance athlete, and put a lot of hope, I guess, into that, and time and effort. And shortly after college graduation, I was hit by a car and fractured my femur. I also had a head injury and a separate injury right around that time. And shortly after, I was diagnosed with an inflammatory condition called ulcerative colitis, which is an autoimmune inflammatory bowel disease. And so that was the first thing that I faced that a doctor, the first one that diagnosed me, said, there's no known cause, there's no known cure, and there's really nothing you can do except maybe this medication will help. And so as a 22-year-old facing something that up to that point, it seemed like if I worked harder, if I did better, I could overcome or at least achieve and had control over that. So to face something without control is what led me to start questioning who I was and what this life was all about. And in that process, I did pray. I said, God, I need your help. I don't really know you, but I need you. And this was after meeting some Mormons, which is an interesting story, in Salt Lake City. But God answered that prayer in a way that I could have never imagined. A week later, he put a guy named Zach Abrams in my life. Zach at the time was an Army officer at Fort Lewis, Joint Base Lewis McChord. And he was the first one second person to truly share the gospel with me. First person to be close enough to my life. He was in my unit. God orchestrated everything for him to not only be able to share with me, love me the way that I really needed to be, and help me get in the Word for myself. So for me, having actually reading the Bible, I'd been going to church as raised Catholic, and also even explored other churches after that. And I'd always kind of been told, given a book to read or something like that. And it wasn't until Zach really helped me start reading the Bible for myself and diving in that my journey with faith and with Jesus truly changed. And so in that process, I did get medically discharged from the Army. Some of those things I was able to put Band-Aids on long enough, especially the gut stuff, to make it by and continue to try to race and things like that. But eventually got hospitalized, was about to have my large intestine removed. Started the medical discharge process, still held on for about 3.5 years of service, and learned a ton during that time. But by the end, it was pretty clear that my physical ability was not my identity. God used the verse, 2 Corinthians 4:16 says, though our outer selves are wasting away, our inner selves are being renewed day by day. And And I experienced in fact, it was almost easier and it was almost better to be following Jesus laying in a hospital bed than it was doing my old life. And the peace I experienced, I've never experienced before. So yeah, I think that's really my testimony, is that my physical ability doesn't define who I am. It's that Jesus defines who I am, and that he's given me a new life and a new identity. And that was 7 or 8 years ago now. So there is a life I now live. Galatians 2:20 was the first verse that someone ever shared with me that did pierce me to the heart and made me start thinking about what that meant to live a life of faith. So that's kind of my testimony. I guess the now, I guess I could share. I did get out of the Army. I moved down here to San Diego. Was fortunate enough to have met you, I think about a year before I moved down. And I consider you my spiritual great grandpa in many ways, since I know you basically passed the JBLM ministry on to Mike Chong. Mike Chong was investing in Zach Abrams, and Zach Abrams was the one who really God used to bring me to faith. And so kind of moved down here to move in with my great grandpa and your ministry. And so since then, I've plugged in more fully with the San Diego Navigators, the Navy Navigators. Learned that God does, in fact, love the Navy down here. But down here, the fact that the harvest was plentiful was always clear to me. Once I caught the vision, December 2014 or so, the harvest was plentiful was clear. I saw that. But the laborers were few was not that clear, in part from a lot of the work that the Lord has used you and others at JBLM. There was a decent number of laborers, and I couldn't see that as a young man, that the laborers were few. The idea that there weren't enough people representing Jesus. And so when I got here, we have an incredible ministry also, but it was younger, I would just say. It was probably the best way to compare them. And I was more senior at that point in my faith too. And not that seniority matters, but that there were young men that were coming even to Bible studies, going to churches locally that weren't being fed, more or less. The idea that the laborers were few, and that in fact, God may want to use me in that way, became more clear down here.
Yeah. It's, man, there's so many places we could go with that. and hopefully we'll get a chance to dive into more of them, different components. But it seems to me that you've already touched on a few themes that I hope folks will pick up from this conversation. So one is just the importance of having your identity transferred from whatever it was before Christ to this new creation in Christ, and what he says about who you are and his purposes for your life. And then secondly, making the shift from being a follower of Jesus to being a follower who has a heart to help other people begin to follow him. And so a disciple who makes disciples. And I know that's been a journey for you, but let's kind of stay at that first part on identity. It's really interesting to me that your identity was very much wrapped up in your physicality as an athlete, as a competitor, and both through this accident of being hit by a vehicle, and then diagnosed with, at the time, a pretty mysterious illness, that pretty much took away that identity. Do you think that you would have, I guess, where do you see God's hand in that? Do you think that you would have followed the path that you have since if Christ had not allowed those difficulties to come?
Yeah, great question. I look forward to seeing the replay, at some point, and Jesus pointing out how he was with me the entire time. I do believe. I always had faith. I believed in God. Just exploring what that meant for me was always somewhere on the to-do list. It always, I'm looking back at even notebooks from when I was 16, I've found, and that's explore my faith, or, learn more about God. Mm-hmm. And, if you asked me if I knew who God was, I would say yes. I had gone to catechism. I'd been confirmed. I'd listened to, this many sermons. But for me, the reason I see God's hand in it, and when I was at West Point, my final year in college, there was a guy named Austin Wilson who I'm really grateful for. He shared Galatians 2:20 and personally shared, just like this across a desk, that Jesus loved me and that he gave himself for me and that he gave me this opportunity to have new life. And my identity at that point, I was training for the collegiate half Ironman championships, which I ended up winning. And that was my identity that fall, was as a triathlete, Brian the runner, the triathlete. But he invited me, and I actually went to some Bible studies that year. I think it was Tuesday night, and I would feel better. I would sing some songs. But at that point, the small group or the breakout sessions were still about 20 people big. And I was more senior, and West Point has a very hierarchical structure. But the interesting thing is I was invited to go to the winter conference, and I even signed up for it. So that was the fall. So fast forward, that would have been January, Martin Luther King weekend. And I was even signed up, but between somewhere in November to January, I decided that, you know what, nationals are actually coming up in April now, collegiate, the Olympic distance. I got to train that weekend. So somehow even though I felt convicted, it was the first time I felt convicted to do something, was to go to this retreat. And turns out you were probably there. Zach Abrams was there. Basically some of the people that God still ended up using in his grace and mercy, like I would have probably met that weekend, and who knows? But I actually believe I was given the opportunity to respond my senior year. And I personally believe God loved me enough to still call me, and it took maybe a little more pain and suffering, I guess, worldly suffering, you could say. I was in the hospital 9 times. I was about 30 pounds lighter than I am now at my weakest. I needed a blood transfusion at one of the hospitalizations because I'd lost so much blood. And so I think that is true, that he gave me an opportunity to respond, and I didn't, and he still loved me enough to basically put his finger on what was really keeping me from him.
Right. I just find it fascinating. The Bible talks about God gifting us, and there are spiritual gifts, but I also think that God designs us, he wires us, he's guiding our development, even in our childhood, and the experiences that we have, the people that we're exposed to at formative times in our lives. And I see your life, and I think it's fascinating that being an athlete, being healthy, again, just the physical component of life has always been something that has stood out to me about you. And even now, we were talking just before recording that you went for a swim before coming over this afternoon to do this podcast.
I'm not training for anything though, just mental.
But that's just always been a big part of your life. And now, as a naturopathic doctor, it's still a part of your life. And I believe it's part of how God is using you and is going to be using you, not just in your work as a naturopathic doctor, but in that community, in that corner of the harvest, so to speak, where you're living for him. And really you're representing an all of life approach to being well-developed and healthy, including the spiritual dimension of being reconciled to God and connected to him through Jesus. But it's also interesting that a big part of how he got your attention and brought you to himself was through the physical side, the struggles that you went through for several years. And even today, I know that that's something that you deal with. So maybe just some encouragement to our listeners that, sometimes difficulties are coming our way, and it isn't God's punishment necessarily. It's part of how he's guiding and developing us and pointing us to where he's going to ultimately use us. Yeah, no, thanks. I do appreciate you seeing that, because I think it's true, and we've, I think, shared life here and there. And while I was here, so it's cool to hear that observation, because I would say I count my physical health as nothing but a gift at this point. I got to go swim today. I didn't have to. I got to work out with guys that I am mentoring and discipling. I get to wake up every day. It's a really amazing thing now. Whereas before, it was not that I had to race triathlon, but it was kind of like people told me that's what I was good at, and I did it. And I will say, before we dive too much further, medical, disclaimer, none of this is medical advice. If I mention any therapies or things that have helped me, as I do have a license that is, could be at hand kind of thing. So that, and then, ask your doctor before starting anything that we talk about. And the other one is to, I know we're talking about healing in part and the work that God has done in regeneration, and that is physical. And, I have been prayed over. I have had faith to be fully healed. And I fully believe in miraculous healing.
And I also know that I believe if I was miraculously healed, that the things that I've learned, I would not be a naturopathic doctor probably. I'd probably still be in the military, probably still be racing triathlon. I think I'd be doing my best to glorify God through that.
Yeah.
However, because it took years to really get to healthier, God, I think, has directed me in a different way. And like you're saying, I did get out, pursued initially conventional medical school. I was going to go to osteopathic school at Liberty University, and it was a great opportunity. But it wasn't until I got here that the opportunity to really look at what naturopathic medicine is and the philosophy, and see how fully that route, which is still a 4-year program, and I lived here when I was in that program, and it's busy, but it is, the naturopathic philosophy is, one, mostly believers were at the founding in Germany in terms of what we now have as the philosophy of naturopathic medicine. I would call it based on the natural laws that God has instructed and given us. But yeah, so I think that my journey wouldn't be the same. I don't discount miraculous healing. I pray for patients. I pray for healing. I've seen and I've heard of miraculous healings. And so it wasn't that there were... So I don't discount that. I know if people may feel that way. And the other caveat is that I am the first Service Academy graduate to become a naturopathic doctor, as far as I know. And so I've gotten, I would say, a decent amount of, it's not true persecution, but when people hear what I'm doing, quacks, this and that, not evidence-based. And so I love that. I actually enjoy it at this point. Working alongside, I say what I do is more integrative medicine, where I, as a naturopathic doctor, licensed, I work alongside medical doctors, nurse practitioners, chiropractors, acupuncturists, therapists, and we, in that sense, and I always refer out if someone has a condition that I don't know how to treat to a specialist. And so I consider myself in some ways a health coach, in some ways a licensed biohacker. I know we've talked about that. And in some ways a primary care provider that can meet you and figure out who is going to be best and what is going to be best able to help you. And that could be physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. And it could be me that is going to do that can help guide you. Or it could be someone else.
So maybe just in a nutshell, I know we could spend the whole hour talking about this, but for those of our listeners who aren't as familiar with the naturopathic medicine, or I don't know if you'd call it medicine, the practice, how would you differentiate that from a traditional medical doctor?
Yeah, and I know you have a great appreciation for language and nuance. I do like calling it conventional medicine or established, whatever you want to call it, because traditional medicine could imply more of like what we know from China or India, or the cultures that have, documented medical things from traditional. But that is the word that most people use. And then so naturopathic medicine versus allopathic medicine is probably the best definition of the philosophy that guides most of conventional care these days, is that if you have a fever, for example, we give you an antipyretic to lower your fever. If you have a bacterial infection, we give a antibiotic, something to treat the opposite. Basically, the treatment is the opposite of what you have. Naturopathic medicine, we do have those tools. I can prescribe medications when needed. I can send for a surgical consult, do anything that a family medicine doctor or provider in California can do. And that's good to have those tools. But the philosophy at its core is really that the body was designed, that we were created to be healthy. We were designed, and of course there are exceptions when we talk about genetic abnormalities and things, that we live in a broken world. And but we do see that when you get a cut, for example, your body will heal it. If you give it everything it needs, you don't need something to stimulate the healing. Your body was innately designed and created to be healing and heal and to be healthy. We were made in God's image. And so the core principle it's called the healing power of nature. And we can take that, and many people have in our modern day, and they say healing as in from natural plants and remedies. But the original philosophy was always the healing power of nature, capital N, meaning it's in your nature. It is in our nature to heal. And that is ultimately, when I was reading that in our initial philosophy classes in school, it did resonate with me because I believe that, I see that every day. And we may, medications or things that block pathways from happening may give our body long enough to cause healing. For example, with my own health, I was put on an anti-TNF drug. So tumor necrosis factor alpha, basically can cause inflammation in the body. You can block that specific cytokine, and about 50% of people with ulcerative colitis will get better. The other 50% usually look for other options because they don't. Like me, it didn't change my life. It didn't cause, blocking that pathway did not allow my body long enough to heal. So even the best medications, 90+% of medications are antagonists. I mean, they block a pathway. The body still has to heal itself. And also before that, though, is removing obstacles to cure and setting the conditions for health. So if there's an obstacle, like we could give the best, mental health treatments, but if you have a stake in your head, we probably need to remove that before we really treat your brain and see, where it's at. So, So I'm big on those two things are the core, I would say, really identifying and removing the root cause.
Yes.
Treating the whole person is another one. Even though my gut was a big factor, the head injury I had before that was actually very significant. My brain was no longer sending signals from the parietal to the frontal lobe, which is where we go from sympathetic to parasympathetic nervous system activation, and parasympathetic being that rest and digest mode. So, and I got that through basically the second time I came to visit, when I was down here for a month in Orange County and would drive down, they really looked at my brain and the hardware. There was an issue, and that was actually affecting my gut. So I say that treating the whole person because even though it was a gut-based disorder and I was seeing gastroenterologists to treat me, focusing on the brain through naturopathic medicine and really did impact my gut, and it continues to. So
Yeah, well, this will be a good place for us to shift over. One of the conversations I've been wanting to have on the show for a while, and I think this episode is going to be a little bit different than what we would typically have, but I think that's a really good thing because a lot of Christianity, and I would say especially a lot of Christianity in the West, we've almost separated the spiritual realm from the physical. And so I know for me, and I think for a lot of people, when we think about the spiritual world, we think of it as being disembodied. So there's my physical life and then there's my spiritual life. And these two are actually disconnected. But scripturally, that's actually not the case at all. In fact, we look forward to a future with a new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. We're promised a bodily resurrection. So these bodies will be transformed, but we will have bodies in the coming age. So it's not like we're just going to be floating spirits or somehow disembodied consciousness. God is committed to this material world, and he created us with physical bodies. And that was not an accident. And it's not something that he's given up on. It's not like, it goes all the way back to this idea that that Gnosticism is something that was a belief system back in the early centuries of the church being established and growing. And it kind of bled into some of the beliefs of early Christians. And so the idea was that matter is inherently evil. It's tainted. And so it was to such an extreme that people would deny the incarnation, that Jesus was a physical man, because how could God take on this evil matter, this evil body? So without going too much further down that road, I think that one of the big challenges we face as modern followers of Jesus is to offer our bodies as living sacrifices, which is our spiritual act of worship. And so you see this connection between me offering my body and that being a spiritual act of worship. I would also say, if you look at some of I know I'm talking a lot here, so I'll try to wrap it pretty quickly. If you look at some of the basic practices of devotion, like fasting, for instance, it's a very spiritual endeavor, but at its core, it's a physical mechanism that I'm choosing to abstain from some sort of material nutrition so that I can focus myself more spiritually.
Right.
So having said that, what are some of the things that you've been learning, both from the way God's guided you over the years, and then more recently as you've really studied the body and naturopathic medicine, and how has that, I guess, influenced your view of discipleship and what it means to follow Jesus and worship God with your body?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, I'm very passionate about this subject, and I will say you probably have gathered that I am more like practical in both my discipleship and even my faith. Like usually it doesn't take me long to know what the next step is for me. And I often step in that direction and keep going. But I have looked more into, I think like you're saying, not that it's philosophy, I think it applies and it's going to help enhance our discipleship. My own personal devotion to Jesus, especially as I look to, I view my career, I guess, as tent making. Just like Paul was a tent maker, it is a job. If God called me to do something else tomorrow, I would do it. I would never see another patient. With that said, I do spend a lot of time studying the body and helping people. I help people physically so that they can grow, mature, and even evolve mentally, emotionally, spiritually. And that is one of my mission statements. And God is using it. I see it, I actually treat a lot of pastors, which is interesting. I don't know how they find me. People find me through their church. It's awesome. And I also say giving hope to those that don't have hope. And that's pretty broad, and that's physical, hope that they can heal, but also that their bodies are not the end all be all. With that said, I think that you absolutely are correct in that we are meant to, this is a temple that we've been given. We've been created in God's image, and that we have to be good stewards. I think that's really where I've focused in on, is that this is a gift. Any physical ability you have is something God's entrusted you with and I think people assume that, okay, Brian, you are maybe a missionary. You're meant to be in the naturopathic field, in the medical field, to be a light. And that is true. I strive for that, and I pray for that opportunity. Flip side, I actually think part of this is true, that I'm supposed to be in that world to translate, decipher, discern what, to bring that to the Christian world, to bring the, well, I heard acupuncture is evil. Okay, well, let's look at it. Is it, and yoga. And then I think we can unpack a lot of that. But I like to focus more on that. I'm sure you've talked through blood, pen, pencil on the podcast, but for me, what I like to focus on is blood. Anything that Jesus said or that he guided us in, that is blood. Like I'm willing to stand for. I'm not going to probably compromise on that. Pen and pencil. Pen is something that it's a conviction that I feel pretty strongly about. But if someone encouraged me to white it out, or if I learned something new, I would white it out and try to replace it. But I am using that to kind of guide some of what I do, the life I live. Pencil being I would also probably call it a preference. Something that, I choose to take communion every Sunday instead of every day or once a month, to do this in remembrance of me, as Jesus said. So anyway, I think in terms of our spiritual health and our physical health, I do think it is probably in the pen range for most of where I stand on a lot of my convictions. With that, with it said, I think that, and that's in part because I meet my ministry with the military. I often find people that are too focused on their health,
right,
or their physical appearance or their abilities.
Right.
However, I think the other side of it can be true. We're neglecting what we've been given. And how does that become worship? I think of it in a few ways. Do you mind sharing the greatest commandment that Jesus gave? And I wrote down Matthew 22. Do you mind sharing the verse?
Yeah. So they asked Jesus, what is the greatest commandment? And he said, the first and greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength.
Yeah. So I'm still learning how to do that with my soul, and I think we all are, hopefully. But the other ones, with all of your heart, with all of your mind, and all of your strength, it's really interesting to think about. If we're going to do that, if we're going to live that out, I think we might need to have healthy hearts, healthy minds, and I would say optimal health in terms of heart health, mind health, and at least strength. And I think if we look at that, that's really interesting, to really maximize our health in those areas, our cardiovascular health, the way our body moves blood and oxygen around the body to nourish the entire system. Our mind, the way that our thoughts influence our health. And the studies are fascinating if we want to go down that route of looking into the research behind that. But I actually think to live out the greatest commandment, we actually do need to be striving for health. And a lot of what I do is actually helping people optimize their health so that dis-ease doesn't have a chance. The word disease actually used to be hyphenated until about 1900. It was dis-ease. And so we didn't just call it things and put labels on pathology, basically is what disease now means. But dis-ease used to mean lack of ease somewhere in the body. There's a restriction. It could be in blood flow. A lot of osteopathic medicine is based on restrictions in blood flow. A lot of chiropractic is based on restrictions in the nervous system and the flow of electrons. Even this morning in a men's group I was at, the idea that the eye is the lamp of the body. If the eye is healthy, the whole body will be full of life. It's interesting to think we have more mitochondrial density in our eyes than the rest of our body. Females have more in their ovaries when they're of childbearing age. So that's one nuance to that. The heart is a close second, but it's interesting that the Bible talks so much about both the eye and the heart. Our mitochondria are basically our energy producing power plants in our cells. And a lot of people, the research on mitochondrial health is fascinating. That's one of the main things I do is help people have enough energy to heal actually and be healthy. And our brain uses a lot of energy. Our heart uses a lot of energy. And actually our eyes do too. So, and they all communicate. So that's the interesting thing. When our eyes get tired, usually our body will become tired too. So I think that, long story short, I think we are called to optimize our health so that we can do what we're called to do. And in that sense, glorify God. And by doing that, I think it's a means to an ends to allow us to worship in other ways. But I actually do believe like God cares about your body. Like he cares about what you do physically, not just how you use it. To kind of go more into your point of this is your physical act of worship in Romans 12:1. So
right.
I know we kind of went through a few things, but you want to get me back on track?
Well, I do think, again, like this is we're kind of broaching a new topic here on the show, but it's one that I've wanted to talk about for a while. And I think there are different levels to it, like the one that you just mentioned. You know, if we're going to pursue God with all of our heart, all of our mind, all of our strength, then we need to, the strength part of that is important. It is possible to make too much of our bodies, but I think a lot of us, especially in our culture and our society, again, we've sort of disconnected our physical bodies from the idea of discipleship. And I think that that's something that we should all try to bring back under the lordship of Christ, which I think gets into two basic areas. One would be stewardship. Like you said, we've been giving whatever you've been given. Some of us are born more athletic than others. Some of us are born with genetic disorders. So it's not that you're striving for perfect health. You're striving to be healthy. You're striving to be a good steward of the health that God has given you. And so I think stewardship is one of it. I think this is why you see a connection between in the New Testament that leadership in the church was supposed to be entrusted to those who had first demonstrated faithfulness in leading their families. And even though it's not exactly the same, because we're talking about our physical bodies, and that would be maybe more in the way of social faithfulness, demonstrated social faithfulness. But I think the principle is similar. It's one of stewardship and demonstrating responsibility in everyone, no matter where you're at. Like even if you're not a parent, what you do have is a body. So the one thing that we can all steward and demonstrate that we value what God has given us and we want to take care of it and make the most of it are these bodies and this life, this physical life that God has given us. So stewardship is one. A second one I think is basic discipleship. So for instance, self-control and self-discipline, we have talked about this before. Self-discipline is when you make yourself do something you don't want to do. Self-control is when you choose not to do something you do want to do, either because it's not good for you or God has prohibited it. And many of us were not developing our self-discipline and our self-control muscles, so to speak. The easiest way to do that, I believe, is through disciplining our bodies. Being physically disciplined to either do things that we don't always want to do or choose not to do things that we do want to do. Those physical urges are, I think, the starting point of learning the spiritual disciplines, that I become more faithful with my spiritual disciplines, or at least I put myself in a better position. If I can be disciplined physically, then I put myself in a position to be more faithful spiritually. So I know we've got a few minutes left here. I know you said that you like to be practical. And so we've been touching on the importance of the body and being faithful as followers of Jesus with our bodies. What are some practical ways that you've in your own life tried to live this out, or some practical things that you would suggest to our listeners that they could begin to make discipleship part of their physical daily lives and not just something that is a spiritual idea in their minds? Yeah,
that's awesome. I agree with everything you said, and I'm excited to expand on that and get practical. So the idea, I definitely agree with the idea of self-control and self-discipline as being important. The way that I would actually help someone do that, most likely starting out, would be by helping them have enough energy to apply. I actually don't think that willpower needs to be the rate limiting step that doesn't allow, well, I was too tired, I was too weak, or whatever the case may be. If you have enough energy and you are seeking first the kingdom of God, you will be able to use that for God's glory. And in the process, if you have enough energy to make the right decisions, basically, on what God's telling you to do, it doesn't mean you'll have unlimited energy. We are governed by the natural laws that were given to us, I think, for our good. Like, we are meant to be asleep at night when the sun goes down and wake up probably with the sun. Some really practical ways are, I think they can be tied to what you're already doing. I do think that morning quiet time is, if you look at I like to think of where are these top performers, because I'm more into optimal health. I really use that to inform even how I treat sick people with diagnoses. Right. I say sick in the sense that, again, dis-ease. I'm looking at where is their lack of ease. If I can work with optimal performance and help those people, I can look at where is someone not optimal. Jesus, like in John 10, my sheep know my voice and others they will not follow. If we really understand health, and that could be unique to you, so it is personalized. I do think that the same thing that might work for me may not work for you, but it's a journey, and it's unique. There are some principles I think guide it. I think sleep, light, nutrition are big ones. So sleep, if we're not sleeping optimally, we are not being renewed the way that we're called to. Romans 12:2, do not be conformed to this world, be transformed by the renewing of our mind. So a lot of people take that, and that is through God's word, I think, and his presence and time in prayer and the word. However, we actually do renew our minds at night. Our glymphatic system, we actually flush toxins out of our brain, and new resources and nutrients come into our brain at night. It's fascinating, and we need to actually dip into the right cycles of sleep to do that. So optimizing sleep, and I'm really grateful for this conversation, because I found a lot of what I know about health before I studied maybe some of the studies that exist on it through podcasts. In fact, I met Jesus only a few months before I found health podcasts that did radically help my life. If I'd been the other way around, I'm kind of concerned where I would have ended up. I think I would have taken it too far to try to live. I went to a conference recently where there are people that are alive that believe they are going to live forever. Right. And it's almost become a religion of itself. And So I'm grateful to see that and realize I don't want that. However, I do want to live the life that I'm called to. So a really practical one would be morning sun. I'm already trying to spend time in the Word every day, getting barefoot on the ground, unfiltered sun. We know that unfiltered sun around 7 a.m. or whenever the sun rises, that we say 7 to 10. Unfiltered sun, at least 15 minutes, ideally more like 30, between 7 and 10 is the best way to actually release melatonin 12 hours later before bed. So getting, and when I say unfiltered, I mean no sunglasses, ideally no sunscreen even at that point.
So this would be not just not just for your eyes, but your skin as well.
Your skin, we have photoreceptors in our eyes and our skin. And actually that does include, if you can catch the sunset and the sunrise and sunset, there's even more benefits. But it's one of the best ways to reset circadian rhythms, meaning our sleep-wake cycles. Mm-hmm. So I think a really practical way to align with the natural approach is to get outside in the morning. Mm-hmm. And I like to do it, with time in the Word. That's kind of how I time it, and it works into my day, but it also serves me physically, spiritually, mentally in so many ways. So really practical one. Another one would be, I do think movement is important. I also think it's very practical, especially, and take someone with you. I don't think you have to do something that, you have to go to the gym if you don't like going to the gym. There's so many ways to find, we do release, endorphins and things like that while working out. And just the idea that we're breaking down the body to build it back up, it's just amazing to be able to even just know that process is happening, that we're being renewed and that we're actually getting stronger. I wrote down a few. I know we said discipleship and disciple making are different. In terms of disciple making, a lot of people look at this verse in 1 Timothy. Paul does tell Timothy to drink a little bit of wine for his stomach and his constant ailments. Now, the principle I would draw from that is that Timothy had kind of entrusted his spiritual health, I would say, in a lot of ways, his life to Paul, and he gave just practical advice. So I think what it tells me is that we should be discussing our health. Like when you and I get together, it is healthy to talk about, hey, I'm doing cold showers this month and I'm using this type of blue blocker glasses to limit my blue light exposure at night, which is another very practical tip. So I think the eyes are very important. I have good vision. I've never had visual issues, but I do notice if my eyes get tired, the rest of my body follows. So I've been looking at really how do I enhance that to enhance my energy, therefore my willpower, therefore my ability to serve in the way that God's called me to.
Yeah.
So light's one that I think we're just on, it's now getting popular, but biophoto modulation is an easy one that almost anyone can influence their health without taking a pill or doing anything different.
Yeah, I think that's really good. So basically sleep, light exposure at the right time of day, and then movement, staying active, trying to be more active. It's so interesting that I think our modern world kind of works against all three of those.
Yes.
And I don't want to be a spiritual conspiracy theorist, but I truly believe that the modern world is really wrecking people's lives. Sure. And I absolutely think that there's a spiritual dimension to that. So again, I'm not saying that, computer screens are of the devil because they damage your eyes, but I am saying that it's all part of life, this life that God has given us. And so we want to be wise. We want to be good stewards. Well, we're going to keep you on here for a few more minutes because we're going to do a little bit of a bonus episode on following Christ in your 20s and especially as a single person. So folks will get to hear a little bit more from you, but I really appreciate you coming on. I hope that we hear a lot of feedback. We'll put some information in the show notes here where people can learn more about you and your work and connect more with you. And I would love to hear what people think about this idea of our bodies being an important part of what we're supposed to steward and how we're supposed to worship Christ so that we can share him with others. So thanks for coming on today, brother. We'll do it again.
Can I share one just kind of encouragement? I think we talked in a lot of directions. Like God has created you uniquely and amazingly, you being those who are listening, and you, Andrew. But I really think that no matter whether it's you maybe haven't thought about your health, your physical health, and how it applies to your spiritual walk, or maybe you've over prioritized, just like when I was, my physical abilities and health. No matter where you are, Jesus loves you, and he's created you uniquely in that way. And so, and now you get to be faithful. And wherever you find yourself, there probably is a next step to take, whether it be less working out or less putting chemicals in your body to end up looking a certain way. Or there might be a step you can take in better stewardship. But yeah, I think that no matter where you're on the spectrum, it's not, we're not saying there's a right way to do it.
Right.
But, and I do actually believe your faith can guide some of that. So that's where it's all tied together. And yeah, we'll provide like my Instagram and things. I'm happy to have these types of conversations.
Yeah. I think I'm glad you shared that at the end, because I do think for some of us, we may be too focused on the physical side of life at the expense of truly following Jesus the way he wants us to. And then I think for a lot of us, we're not stewarding the physical side of our person very well. And we may not even be aware of how that's preventing us or what that's costing us in terms of following Jesus. So I do appreciate you sharing that. And all of us kind of need to do that self-assessment to find out what the appropriate next step would be. All right, brother. Hey, thanks again. And we'll do it again soon.
Awesome. Thank you.